experiencing as a police officer on the streets of the city of San Jose was that we didn't have a war on drugs, we had drug prohibition, and we had a war on people.
And now it's my pleasure to introduce our chair of the day from the FBI, Mr. Ralph Diaz, is going to introduce our speaker. Ralph.
Thank you, President David. Good afternoon to all of you. Today I have the pleasure of introducing our guest speaker, Mr. Russ Jones. Mr. Jones has been involved with the counter-drug effort probably for about 40 years. 10 of those years he worked in San Jose, California as a narcotics detective. He was assigned to a Drug Enforcement Administration led task force. As a government intelligence agent, he worked in Latin America observing narcotics trafficking during the Nicaraguan Contra conflict. In academia, he conducted studies of the impact of drug abuse on the crime index, wrote training programs for identifying the psychological and physiological symptoms of narcotics use. He developed rehabilitation programs designed specifically for those that were court mandated to participate. He's traveled throughout the Soviet Union and China to study their drug problems and policies. In the field of drug rehabilitation, Mr. Jones implemented and taught courses for various California and Texas counties, as well as for privately run programs. He is a court-recognized expert both in federal court and state courts on the field of narcotics enforcement. He currently resides in New Braunfels. Please help me welcome Mr. Russ Jones.
Thank you. I'm a speaker for the Drug Policy Forum of Texas, and I've got brochures on the tables there. I also represent LEAP. That's Law Enforcement Against Prohibition. We're a nonprofit international organization of current and former members of law enforcement. We're judges, prosecutors, chiefs of police, narcotics detective, DEA agents. All of us believe that the methods that are being used currently in this war on drugs, which was supposed to alleviate those four categories of harm, has instead made them infinitely worse. Now, usually, as soon as I make that statement, there's people in the group who go, oh no. This is one of those guys who wants to give up control. And nothing can be farther from the truth. We feel that the fight in this war on drugs can be fought smarter and more successfully than it is today under this current failed policy. So let me explain how I came to this conclusion. Some of you in this room are old enough to remember when Nixon ran for president. And he coined the phrase, the war on drugs. Well, in 1970, his first year of office was the year I entered law enforcement. And as a police officer on the streets of a major city, I saw little evidence of drugs, of a problem with drugs in our community at that time. We had no street gangs. We had no drive-by shootings. We had none of the other problems associated with drug violence that we see today. There certainly weren't any headlines in the San Jose Mercury News about large narcotic seizures. What I was experiencing as a police officer on the streets of a major city was that we did not have a war on drugs. We had drug prohibition, and we had a war on people. A war was beginning to be waged on a large segment of our population, and almost all the arrests were for simple possession, not for being under the influence or not for committing crimes while under the influence. Well, in 1974, I was transferred to the Narcotics Division. See, the U.S. government was beginning to fund massive grants to law enforcement agencies all across this nation. And the San Jose Police Department's narcotics team was expanding from a small 5-man unit to a 15-man division within the Detective Bureau. Now, within the Narcotics Division, I was immediately assigned what was called the Major Violator Unit. I really do miss that here. But working in this capacity, I started buying ounce quantities of cocaine and methamphetamine. And of course, that'd be followed up by an arrest and a search warrant. We started making headlines in the San Jose Mercury News. And the district attorney would announce that we had made a major blow to our community's drug network. Of course, what would follow would be that someone would take that dealer's place in the organization. Soon I was infiltrating and buying from pound quantity dealers. More arrests, more headlines. Another table full of dope, guns, and money. Another pronouncement by the district attorney or the chief of police. Of course, soon we narcotics officers standing off to the side of the press conference would cut a glance at each other and smirk and smile. See, we knew nothing was going to change. We knew someone was maneuvering to take this dealer's place in the organization. And we were also learning that when someone maneuvers to take over, it's not done with attorneys and contracts. It's done with violence and bloodshed, which we were beginning to experience all over San Jose. We couldn't explain the rapid rise in violent crime until, while working undercover and with informants, I discovered that San Jose had become the hub of the newly formed Nuestra Familia. That was the first real street gang in San Jose as we know street gangs today. During that time, I was also a part-time student at the University of San Francisco, and I wrote a thesis on the impact of drug abuse on crime in the community. Bottom line of that study was that 80% of our prisoners were in jail for a drug or drug-related offense. Now, I couldn't quite articulate it at the time, but I was beginning to question what we were doing in this war on drugs. See, I had a sense that the war on drugs was a war on a problem created by Prohibition, created by the war on drugs. Well, you can imagine my disappointment as a student when my professor pointed out to me that there was nothing new to this discovery, the connection between prohibition and crime. See, Albert Einstein had already commented on that connection due to the rise in crime during alcohol prohibition. Well, in 1977, I was an officer with the DEA task force in San Jose, and my investigations range from a federal judge who was eventually indicted and removed from office to criminal actions of organizations which fell under the federal racketeering statutes. I infiltrated and rode with the Hells Angels. I bought large amounts of methamphetamine, and that led to the seizure of several methamphetamine labs. Those cases, along with other investigations, led to an indictment against 36 members of the Hells Angels. With the DEA, there were other large cases, buys of multi-pound quantities of cocaine, heroin, marijuana, seizures of plane loads of dope. Nothing was changing. Nothing was getting better. It was only getting worse. We had more deaths by overdose, more disease, more crime, more violence, and certainly more drug use. So what's the impact of drug seizures done on supply and demand in our country? Well, this is the price and purity chart produced by DEA in their own briefing book. The cost, inflation adjusted, is the average cost to get a fix and the average purity. By purity, I mean what percentage of the narcotic is in the product they're buying. Now, I backed up to 1970, to the beginning of the war on drugs, where you can see that the average dose cost $6, and the average purity was 1.5%. That was some pretty weak product. But by 1980, the purity had doubled to 3.6%, and the cost was down to $3.90. By 1999, the average dose was down to 80 cents. The strength of the product today is up to 38%. 10 years later, by the way, this trend continues. You see, the principle of supply, demand, and prices applies to an illegal business just as well as it applies to your business today. The chart shows that prices are way down. Well, if demand is just constant, let alone up as we know it is, then we know supply of drugs into this country is up. Oh, someone from the Department of Justice will come in here and give you a talk, and they'll tell you how they're interdicting 20 to 40% of the drugs coming into this country. I'll argue that drug cartels are smuggling in way more than they think they need. They're writing off as acceptable loss whatever we interdict, and the drug cartels are getting in the full 100% of the drugs they need. The problem continues to get worse the more people and the more money our government is throwing at this war. 1972, DEA had about 3,000 employees. By 2005, 11,000 employees. Their annual budget went from $65 million to $2.1 billion. 1999 government spending as a result of the war on drugs exceeded $30 billion. Estimates today put that figure as high as $70 billion. So how's this effort and spending affected drug arrest? Well, in 1970, the year I entered law enforcement, you can see down there at the bottom, we had 415,000 drug arrests across the nation. By 1980, we barely surpassed 500,000. But by 2005, we quadrupled that figure to 1.9 million people arrested every year for drugs. Nearly half of those are for marijuana, and 88% of those are for just simple possession of marijuana. Now, let me put that 1.9 figure into perspective for you. That's the population of the state of New Mexico. We are now arresting the equivalent to the population of the state of New Mexico every year for drugs, and the vast majority is for simple marijuana possession. You can treat addiction, but you'll never get over a conviction. A drug conviction is going to follow our young people the rest of their lives. It's going to keep them from student loans, housing, government assistance. It's going to keep them from many meaningful private sector jobs, and it's certainly going to keep them from government jobs. Now, I work with high school kids in community programs today. I've taught extensively in court-mandated programs for teenagers as well as adults. All the kids tell me it's easier to get drugs than it is to get alcohol and tobacco. Well, how can that be? It's because our government does not regulate the sale of drugs. The drug dealer does. The drug dealer decides who to sell to, where to sell, when to sell, what to sell, and for how much. There's only one question the drug dealer has of your kids. Have you got the money? How much money are we talking about? That's $225 million that was just seized here recently in one case. Think some of that might invite corruption? International drug trade generates $400 billion a year annually, and it's going to the drug cartels and groups like Al-Qaeda who are funding terrorist activities all over the world. This is all profit, because what are we talking about here? Marijuana is a weed. Cocaine just comes from a bush. Opiates come from a flower. There's no real value to any of these plants until you do what? Until you make them illegal. When, as a police officer, I arrested a rapist, the community was safer. But when I arrested a drug dealer, all I did was create an immediate job opening for a long line of guys who are willing to risk it all for a piece of those obscene profits. I left law enforcement in 1980, and I sailed from San Francisco down to Costa Rica on a sailboat. I showed up there as a boat bum, an ex-cop, an ex-Army combat helicopter pilot, and I infiltrated what was called the Southern Front for the Nicaraguan Contra effort. There I was hired to train Nicaraguan pilots in American aircraft such as this. But my real assignment from the start was to gather intelligence on everything from weapons trafficking to narcotics trafficking. In fact, this is the aircraft I used to fly in and out of the secret airfield, or what they called in Senate hearings a secret airfield in Costa Rica, where drugs were shipped out while our government officials were looking the other way. You know, our government's involvement in narcotics trafficking was made public during congressional hearings in 1987, and then later by investigative reporting by Gary Webb of the San Jose Mercury News. Well, with the public disclosure they ran Contra affair, I was back in California, and I was working in various capacities to prosecutors and defense attorneys as a consultant. I testified in state and federal court as a forensic expert in the psychological and physiological effects of drugs and how that may or may not played a role in cases such as rape and homicide. I completed further work and studies in reg education, which included the writing of an instructor's manual to be used specifically for court-mandated clients. Now, as a result of all this experience and expertise, in 1988 and 1989, I was invited by the Ministries of Interior of both Communist China and the Soviet Union to travel throughout the countries and observe and work with their law enforcement agencies. In China, I traveled throughout and I consulted with their police officials who were in charge of narcotics enforcement. I met with their local police officers. I was even allowed into Tibet, which at that time had been closed to Westerners. I met there with their law enforcement officials and community leaders. It was the Soviet Union, though, still behind the Iron Curtain back then, which allowed me the greatest exposure to their approach to the drug problem. I consulted with their narcotics enforcement experts, and I met with other top law enforcement officials. I worked with their police officers in Leningrad, Moscow, Yalta, and other major cities. I witnessed drug dealing on the streets. I went with them on a search warrant where we seized a methamphetamine lab. I visited many recovering addicts in their rehabilitation programs. And I came back to the United States with this question. If a Soviet Union, still behind the Iron Curtain, as tight and controlling of its citizens as it was unable to control illegal drugs through prohibition, then how are we as a free people ever going to? The United States over the last 4 decades has fueled the war on drugs with $1 trillion of our tax dollars. We've made 38 million nonviolent drug arrests. What are the results? Our courts today are still choked with ever-escalating drug prosecutions. We've quadrupled our prison population to 2.2 million. Prison building is now one of the fastest growing industries. It certainly is here in Texas. We're going to arrest another 1.9 million people this year. Again, equivalent to the population of the state of New Mexico. The U.S. has only 4.6% of the world's population, yet we have 22.5% of the world's prisoners. Here, in the land of the free, and keep in mind that the majority are there for nonviolent drug offenses. Now, after all these people arrested, all these people in prison, all the personnel we've used, all the money we've spent on this war on drugs, the rate of addiction today is 1.3%. That's the same rate it was in 1970 when we began this war on drugs. Albert Einstein defined insanity as doing the same thing over and over and over again and expecting different results. Well, ladies and gentlemen, if we want different and if we want better results, then we need to be doing something different. One of the first things I think we need to do is reframe the debate. We need to move it away from the polarized ideological positions we see it argued in today, and we need to put it squarely in the arena of rational, evidence-based policy thinking. See, I think the facts and evidence I provide so far make it clear that using the blunt tool of law enforcement to deal with complex social and health concerns is counterproductive. I'm not alone in this. This isn't a left or right issue. This isn't a conservative, liberal issue. This isn't a Democrat, Republican issue. This is a failed policy issue. As I mentioned at the beginning, our speakers include judges such as California Superior Court Judge Jim Gray. We have prosecutors, chiefs of police such as retired San Jose Chief of Police Joseph McNamara. Norm Stamper, retired Chief of Police of Seattle. Nobel Prize winner Milton Friedman was a member of LEAP until his death recently. William F. Buckley Jr. supported our cause. George Shultz, past Secretary of State, supports what we're doing here. He's now at the Stanford Hoover Institute. In 2006, before he died, Walter Cronkite said, "I cannot help but wonder how many more lives, how much more money will be wasted before another politician admits what is plain for all to see. The war on drugs is a failure." All right, one point I think everyone will agree with me here in this room on is that drugs, including alcohol and tobacco, are potentially dangerous, and their use is inherently risky. Please, though, keep in mind, you can be anti-drug and yet pro-reform of this current failed policy. See, we didn't end alcohol prohibition because we suddenly decided alcohol was okay. No, alcohol isn't just okay. But we ended alcohol prohibition because prohibition didn't work. Prohibition drove people from beer and wine to very hard and adulterated liquor. We ended prohibition because of the crime and violence due to the black market, due to the deaths and disease from an impure product. We ended alcohol prohibition due to the uncontrolled and unregulated market, which was actually making it easier back then for kids to get booze. We realized that the damage to society was worse through prohibition than the damage to some who abused alcohol. So, We need a drug policy that's based on the evidence of effectiveness, and it needs to be rational and scientific rather than moral and ideological. The policy needs to offer good value for our tax dollars. Policy needs to be based on reality. You see, most incidents of death, disease, crime, and drug use is caused by drug prohibition. Death is caused by an impure product of uncertain strength. Diseases such as AIDS and hepatitis is spread by drug paraphernalia. Crime is increased because the drug user is looking for a way to support their choice of drug at black market prices. And crime is increased because the dealer needs to protect or expand his territory. Drug use is on the increase because dealers promote their product by using multi-level marketing techniques, which require the new dealer to find new users. The new dealer can't sell to existing customers. That's what the cause of a lot of this bloodshed is. So he goes to the high school and college parties. He gives out free samples until our kids find a drug of choice. Then he starts charging them. So what might be a solution? Well, we need to remove the profit motive. We need to fight this war economically by ending prohibition. In doing so, we take away organized crime's single largest source of income. Regulate with laws that prohibit selling to minors, driving under the influence. Public, no use of public. Regulate with stricter laws, no marketing, no advertising. Now, I'm not talking about going into a pharmacy, going back to the days where you could go into a pharmacy and buy heroin or cocaine across the counter. No, that is not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about, first of all, getting the Department of Justice out of the doctor's office, because what medicines I take should be between me and my doctor. Therefore, I'm talking about addicts being able to go to a doctor and get a prescription that they can then take to a health clinic where they can get their dose administered by a nurse or a health clinician. Once addicts are able to go to a clinic, you've taken away the street dealer. You've removed that $400 billion a year profit from the drug cartels. You've collapsed the illegal drug business, just as we did with the Al Capones and the Bugs Moran and the Lucky Lucianos in the 1933s. One of the best benefits of regulation is we're going to reduce drug use because no one is going to be marketing to our kids. They won't be able to compete with the market. Street gangs today aren't distilling alcohol and trying to sell it in our school parking lots. Drug cartels are not growing tobacco in our state parks, in our national forests, and selling it on the street corners. That's why kids tell you it's easier to get drugs than it is to get alcohol and tobacco. I might add, when's the last time you've heard of a drive-by shooting between Bud Light and Coors? When is the last time Marlboro hired a 12-year-old kid to run tobacco from one street corner to another? All right, you might ask me, has this been tried elsewhere? From Australia to Canada, Europe, we've implemented harm reduction policies. And I have time for one example, Switzerland. In Switzerland, heroin is dispensed freely to addicts in clinics. There's been a 50% decline in overdose deaths. In fact, there's never been an overdose death in a clinic. There's a reduction in AIDS and hepatitis. Crime's been cut by 60%. There's been an 82% decline in the number of new addicts, and there's a continuing decline because no one, number one, is on the street trying to build a drug business. And the drug user is in constant contact with a treatment counselor every day when they go in to get their daily fix. Employment amongst addicts has doubled in Switzerland. See, we could redirect just some of that $70 billion to educational programs. Look what we've done with tobacco in the last 10 years. Now, tobacco is the deadliest and most addicting of the drugs. Yet we've reduced the use of tobacco in the last 10 years from 42% down to 17%. And we've done that without kicking in any doors, without firing any shots, without arresting anyone. Time for one last picture. This picture was taken in 1932, right at the height of the war on alcohol, and I want you to notice the police officer, the women, and the children. Now remember, it was the Women's Temperance Union that was active in bringing about alcohol prohibition to begin with. So why now, 12 years later, the Women's Organization for National Reform? It's right there on the side of the car. End prohibition. Save our children. Thank you for having me here today. Do we have time for questions? Here first, and then...
Actually, he asked a very similar question to what I was considering. One of the things that is wonderful about your talk today is that this is something that those of us, I was a criminal judge, those of us who have had an opportunity to see a lot of this sort of activity and the people that are involved in this kind of activity and who also, in my opinion, are victims of it, is that nobody has ever articulated it as clearly as you do. And I want to thank you very much for doing that. But I am concerned about whether or not we have politicians in this country that have the courage to come forward and actually devise and pass a plan that is similar to this. But for those of you who don't know what it's like to deal with people that have these kinds of problems, they're extremely complex, and the punishment is so harsh that it very often means that even if you're a young person, 17, 18 years old, you get picked up for a very minor offense related to drugs, that for the rest of your lives, you cannot go to law school, you cannot get into a lot of programs that license you for employment, you can't get bonded. There are any number of things that are not available to you for the rest of your life.
Yeah, if you experience what the term now is youthful indiscretion, and you weren't arrested and you admit it, you can become a teacher, lawyer, professor, senator, president of the United States. But if you're arrested, even for a minute amount, you will never become a teacher, lawyer, professor, congressman, president of the United States. So there is something wrong with what we're doing. We're destroying lives. The war on drugs is worse. What I'm talking about here is not going to solve the problem of abuse and addiction. We are still going to have to deal with that. But what I want to get rid of is all this violence that's occurring on the border, in Mexico, in Colombia, on our streets, in Philadelphia, Chicago, and even here in San Antonio. Questions? I will stick around if you have more questions. Thanks again. What's the biggest impediment moving forward? It is the moral and ideological issue. Some people believe it's okay for me to have my glass of wine, but it's not okay for you to have your drug. It's just morally wrong for you to do what you're doing. Yes. Any drug you don't want to legalize will leave that in the hands of the drug cartel selling on the street corner.